She said we should stop, but the way her eyes lingered on mine told a different story. And in that silence I realized some feelings refused to be buried. I still remember the first time I noticed her differently. Not as my friend's mom. Not as the woman who had opened her home to us 100 times before. But as someone who carried herself with a quiet grace I couldn't ignore anymore. That evening started like so many others. My friend had invited a few of us over, just a casual get-together, nothing out of the ordinary. Laughter filled the living room, the sound of a video game humming from the TV, half-empty soda cans on the coffee table. Everything looked like it always did. But then, she walked in. She was wearing something simple, just a soft cardigan over a fitted blouse, the kind of outfit you'd barely notice if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed. The way the light caught the faint shimmer of her necklace. The way her sleeves were pushed back just enough to reveal slender wrists, the kind of detail that makes someone look effortlessly elegant. She greeted everyone with that gentle smile of hers, her voice warm yet carrying a firmness that made people listen. When she handed me a cup of coffee, our fingers almost touched. Almost. Just a brush, really. But it sent a ripple through me. I pretended not to think about it, but I did. Her perfume was subtle, something floral with a grounding note underneath, like jasmine mixed with sandalwood. It lingered long after she moved past me, and I found myself following it with my eyes. She laughed at something my friend said, tossing her hair back in that absent-minded way women sometimes do when they're not even trying to draw attention. But attention was drawn all the same. The sound of her laugh stuck with me, not loud, not forced, just warm. Like it could melt the edges off a cold day. I caught myself watching her more than I should have. At first, it was just small details. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how she leaned slightly on the counter when she listened, how her gaze softened when she spoke. None of it was meant for me, and yet I couldn't help feeling like I was the only one really noticing. And then came the eye contact. It wasn't long, just a moment when her eyes met mine across the room. But it lingered. A second too long, maybe two. Enough for my chest to tighten before she glanced away and busied herself with the kettle. I told myself I was imagining things. She was just being polite. That was all. But deep down, I knew better. Later, when she brought in a tray of snacks, our paths crossed again. I reached for a plate at the same time she did, and this time our hands did touch. Briefly. Lightly. But in that instant, the noise of the room faded. I felt the warmth of her skin against mine, and though it lasted less than a heartbeat, I carried it with me for the rest of the night. I sat there afterward, pretending to focus on the game, but my mind was elsewhere. On her. On the way her presence seemed to fill every corner of the house, not in an overwhelming way, but in a way that made me wonder how I had never noticed it before. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know where it would lead. All I knew was that something subtle had shifted between us. A glance, a brush of hands, a silence heavy with meaning. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. That was the beginning, the first glimpse of tension. The moment I realized she wasn't just my friend's mom anymore. She was a woman I couldn't stop noticing. The night wore on, and the house slowly grew quieter. My friend had gone upstairs to grab something, leaving me in the living room with his mom. At first, it felt like one of those ordinary pauses, the kind where you check your phone or wait for the conversation to resume when someone comes back. But then she spoke. "Do you want some tea instead of coffee this late?" she asked, her tone light but thoughtful, as if she had been paying closer attention than I realized. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to stay near her, and followed her into the kitchen. The space was dimly lit, warm, with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards under our steps. It felt quieter than the rest of the house, almost like a separate world. She moved around with ease, pulling mugs from the cupboard, setting the kettle on the stove. I leaned against the counter, watching. Not in a way that was obvious, but I couldn't help noticing the small details again. The curve of her wrist as she poured water, the way her blouse slipped slightly off her shoulder before she tugged it back into place. She carried herself with that same quiet confidence, but there was a softness to it too. "You read much?" she asked suddenly, glancing over her shoulder at me. I laughed lightly. "When I have time. Mostly late at night." She smiled at that, setting 2 tea bags into the mugs. "Me too. I always tell myself I'll read earlier in the day, but somehow it never works out. By the time I sit down with a book, it's past midnight." That led us into a conversation I hadn't expected. Books we liked, stories that had stayed with us, the kind of themes that seemed to circle back into our lives when we needed them most. It wasn't small talk, it was the kind of conversation you usually only have with someone who understands you, someone who listens closely enough to catch the pauses between your words. Her eyes had this way of holding me when I spoke. She didn't just look at me, she saw me. And I realized how rare that felt. With most people, words slip past half-heard. But with her, everything I said seemed to matter. At one point I made her laugh. A small joke, nothing I thought twice about, but the way her laughter filled the kitchen stayed with me. She leaned on the counter, covering her mouth for a second as though she was caught off guard by how much she enjoyed it. And then came that silence, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, but heavy with something unspoken. I felt it then, that shift in the air again. The kettle clicked off behind her, but neither of us moved right away. We just looked at each other, a faint smile lingering on her lips, my heart beating faster than it should have. When she finally turned back to pour the water, I noticed her hand tremble ever so slightly. It was subtle, almost hidden, but I caught it. She steadied herself quickly, as though pretending nothing had happened. She handed me the mug, and for a moment, our fingers brushed again. This time, it wasn't accidental. Or maybe it was, but the pause, the way either of us pulled back right away, made it feel like something else. I sipped the tea just to steady myself. She did the same, her gaze flicking to mine before drifting away again. We didn't say anything more for a while. We didn't need to. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft clink of mugs against the counter, the distant sound of crickets outside, it was enough. That was the night I realized how easy it was to talk to her. How natural it felt, like the rest of the world blurred when it was just us. I knew I shouldn't linger on it. She was my friend's mom. There were 100 reasons why it couldn't, shouldn't, mean anything. And yet, it did. It was in the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. The way her laugh stayed in my chest long after it faded. The way silence between us didn't feel empty, but alive. That night didn't change everything, not yet. But it left me wondering, if a simple conversation could feel this deep, what would happen if I allowed myself to step closer? The next few days blurred together, but her presence stayed with me. Even when I wasn't in that house, I kept replaying the moments in the kitchen, the conversation, the laughter, the silence that felt like it carried more weight than either of us dared admit. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But the way my chest tightened when I thought of her, it didn't feel like nothing. The following weekend, I was back at my friend's place. Same living room, same easy noise of the TV, same circle of friends sprawled across the couch. But I couldn't shake the awareness of her moving in and out of the room. Every time she walked past, every time her voice floated into the background, it pulled my attention in ways I couldn't fight. At one point, she came in carrying a folded blanket for my friend's younger sister. She placed it on the chair, and when her eyes met mine, it happened again, that pause, that unspoken connection. Only this time, instead of letting it linger, she looked away quickly, her expression tightening just enough for me to notice. Later that evening, when most of the noise had faded and my friend was upstairs on a call, I found myself in the hallway. She was there too, stacking a few stray plates to take into the kitchen. Our paths crossed, and for a second either of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it I hadn't heard before. You shouldn't look at me like that." The words hit harder than I expected. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, but the meaning was clear. I swallowed, not sure how to respond. "I didn't realize I was." Her lips pressed into a faint smile, not out of amusement, but as though she was trying to soften the moment. She shook her head slightly. You did. And I noticed. There it was, the boundary line, spoken out loud for the first time. The hallway felt too quiet, the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house suddenly louder. I shifted, unsure whether to apologize or defend myself. But before I could, she continued. This, whatever you think this is, it can happen. You understand that, don't you? Her eyes met mine then, and for all her words of finality, there was something else in her gaze. Something fragile, hesitant. Like she was telling me to stop, but hoping I wouldn't listen too closely. I understand, I said quietly, though part of me didn't believe it. She exhaled slowly, as if relieved to have said it out loud. She shifted the plates in her arms, her body angled slightly away, yet her feet didn't move. We stood there, only a few feet apart, the air between us tense and heavy. I could see the conflict in her. Her jaw set with determination, but her eyes softening with something else, something closer to longing than denial. It was in the way her shoulders rose and fell, the way she hesitated before finally stepping past me. As she walked away, her sleeve brushed my arm, and even that small contact felt like a spark I couldn't ignore. I stood there long after she disappeared into the kitchen, my mind spinning. She had drawn the line, clear as day. She had said the words. This can't happen. But the tremor in her voice told me another story. And the way she avoided looking back told me she felt the same weight I did. That night, lying in bed, I kept hearing her voice. Not just the words themselves, but the way they cracked, almost imperceptibly, on the word can't. And I realized, sometimes people say things to protect themselves, not because they truly mean them. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just in my head. She felt it too, and now she was fighting it. After that night in the hallway, I told myself to create distance. To respect the line she had drawn, even if I wasn't convinced she truly believed it herself. But life doesn't always unfold the way we plan. It started with small things. One afternoon, my friend had to run an errand, leaving me at the house waiting for him to get back. His mom was in the kitchen, sorting through groceries, and I offered to help. She hesitated for a second, then nodded, sliding a bag across the counter toward me. We didn't talk much at first. Just the rustle of paper bags, the clink of jars being placed in cupboards, the hum of the refrigerator. But there was something strangely comforting in the silence. Like even without words, the presence of the other filled the space in a way that didn't need to be explained. Eventually, she broke the quiet. You don't have to help, you know. Most people your age would just sit and scroll on their phone until they were rescued. I smiled faintly. Maybe I'm not like most people my age. Her eyes flicked toward mine, and for just a heartbeat, there was that softness again. That look I'd seen before, the one she quickly masked whenever she realized it had slipped through. Later that week, it happened again. My friend had fallen asleep early after a long day, and I ended up downstairs, restless, unable to settle. The house was dim, the glow of a single lamp stretching shadows across the living room. And there she was, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, a book open on her lap. You're still awake? I asked, keeping my voice low. She nodded. Always. It's when the house is quiet that I can finally hear myself think. I hesitated at the doorway, but she gestured toward the empty seat beside her. Sit. Unless you're worried I'll scold you for staying up late. I laughed quietly and sat down, though careful to keep a respectable distance. Still, even a few inches on the couch felt too close, too dangerous. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the faint trace of her perfume mixing with the steam from her tea. We talked. Not about anything monumental, just little pieces of life. She asked about my plans for the future, what I wanted to do, whether I thought I was where I should be at this point in life. The kind of questions that dig deeper than they seem. And when I asked her about her own dreams, she paused, looking down at her hands. Dreams change when you get older, she said softly. You stop thinking about what you want and start thinking about what's best for everyone else. There was a heaviness in her voice that made me want to reach for her hand, to tell her she deserved more than self-sacrifice. Instead, I just nodded, trying to let her know without words that I understood. At one point, a strand of her hair slipped across her cheek, and before I could stop myself, I almost reached out to tuck it behind her ear. I caught the impulse in time, pulling my hand back, but not before she noticed. Her eyes lifted to mine, catching me in that moment of hesitation. Neither of us said anything, but the silence spoke loudly. When the tea was finished, she stood to take her cup to the kitchen. As she passed, her shoulder brushed mine lightly. It was the smallest touch, but my chest tightened all the same. Lying in bed later, I knew she was right. We shouldn't be sitting together in the quiet like that. We shouldn't be sharing conversations that felt more intimate than they had any right to. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. These were moments that shouldn't happen. But they did. And with each one, the line she had drawn in that hallway felt thinner, easier to cross. It was late. The kind of late when even the house itself feels like it's sleeping. My friend had gone upstairs hours earlier, and I was still in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV just to keep myself awake. She came downstairs quietly, almost like she didn't want to be heard. She wore a light sweater, her hair loosely tied back, and for a moment she just stood at the edge of the room, as if deciding whether or not to step closer. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, lowering the volume. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Never can. The later it gets, the more awake I seem to feel." I nodded, knowing the feeling. "Guess we're the same in that way." She sat down in the armchair across from me, curling her legs slightly beneath her. The glow of the TV cast a soft light over her face, highlighting the thoughtful lines around her eyes. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular, music, movies, even a bit about my plans for work. But underneath every word I felt the pull. The silence between sentences lasted too long. The way she looked at me lingered a second too much. And then it happened. Her expression shifted, and she looked down, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "We shouldn't do this," she said quietly. I froze. "Do what?" She exhaled, her voice unsteady but firm. "Whatever this is. These late-night talks, the closeness. It's not right." Her words should have been sharp enough to cut through the air. But they weren't. They trembled, softened by something she wasn't saying out loud. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "You think we've crossed a line?" She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of strength and vulnerability. "Not yet. But we're close. And if we keep going like this, we will. I know it." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just watched her, the way her chest rose and fell, the way her fingers fidgeted like she was holding back more than words. "You don't sound sure," I finally said. Her lips parted, but she didn't respond right away. She turned her gaze toward the window, where the reflection of the TV flickered against the glass. "I have to be sure. For your sake, and mine. For his sake." She meant my friend. The reminder hit me, but it didn't erase what was in the room between us. "You're right," I said softly. "But if you really want to stop, you'll have to say it like you mean it." Her eyes snapped back to mine, wide and startled. She wasn't expecting me to challenge her. The silence after that felt endless. Her breathing uneven, her fingers gripping the edge of her sweater. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again. Finally, she whispered, "We should stop." But the words came out fragile, barely above a breath. And I knew. She didn't mean it. Not completely. I leaned back, my heart beat loud in my ears, and let the weight of it settle. She had said the words, drawn the line again. Yet the way her voice cracked told me everything I needed to know. She was fighting something she didn't want to win. When she stood to leave, she didn't look back. But the way her hand lingered on the chair for a moment before letting go, that told its own story. That night, I lay awake, hearing her voice in my head. "We should stop." Over and over. But what haunted me wasn't the words. It was the way they broke, trembling with the truth she couldn't hide. The next evening, the house was quieter than usual. My friend had gone out with others, leaving me behind to study at the dining table. Books and notes spread across the wood, the faint scratch of my pen the only sound in the room. She appeared in the doorway, holding a folded blanket. For a moment, she just stood there, as though debating whether to step closer. Finally, she set the blanket on the back of the chair and asked softly, "Studying late again?" I smiled faintly. "It's the only time I can focus." She nodded, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed. There was something different about her that night, the way her shoulders sloped, the way her eyes carried a weariness I hadn't seen before. After a pause, she crossed the room and sat opposite me, her chin resting in her hand. "You're going to burn yourself out," she said. I shrugged, closing the book. "Maybe. But it feels better than sitting still." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes didn't quite match it. For a while, silence stretched between us, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. And then, without looking at me, she whispered the words again. "We should stop." The same words from before, but heavier this time. They hung in the air, pulling all the oxygen out of the room. I studied her carefully. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wood. Her voice was quiet, but it wasn't steady. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low. "Then say it like you mean it." Her head lifted, eyes locking with mine, startled. For a moment, she looked as though she had been caught, like I had pulled something unspoken into the light. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, her breath caught uneven. I saw the way her hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale, holding on as if the truth might pull her under. "You can say the words," I continued softly, "but you don't believe them." "Not really." She shook her head slowly, her expression torn between defiance and surrender. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "I do understand," I said. "I know why you think it's wrong. I know why you want to push me away. But I also know you feel it too. And that's what scares you." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, the muted sounds of the street outside, everything else faded until it was just us, staring across the table. Her eyes softened then, the fight in them weakening. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold back whatever wanted to spill out. But her hand betrayed her, trembling slightly as she reached for her tea, only to set it back down untouched. I moved my hand forward, slowly, deliberately, until it rested near hers. Not touching, just close enough to bridge the space if she chose. Her gaze dropped to my hand, lingering there for a long time before returning to my eyes. The vulnerability in her expression was unmistakable. "I can't," she whispered, almost pleading with herself more than with me. But she didn't move her hand away. I let my fingers brush against hers, the lightest touch, enough to send a shiver through me. She didn't pull back. Instead, her shoulders sagged, as though the weight of pretending had finally become too much. Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the rawness of being seen. And in that moment I knew she didn't want to stop. She wanted me to understand that she had to say it, even if her heart disagreed. I held her gaze steady and calm. "You don't have to pretend with me." For the first time, she didn't argue. She just sat there silent, her fingers still brushing against mine. And the quiet between us wasn't filled with resistance anymore, it was filled with surrender. That night stretched longer than it should have, time bending around the quiet between us. We stayed at the table for a while, either of us willing to move, as if breaking the moment would undo everything that had been building. Her hand was still near mine, fingers brushing softly against my skin, a touch so subtle but so charged it felt louder than any word she could have spoken. Finally, she exhaled, a long, shaky breath, as though she had been holding it for years. Her shoulders slumped, and she leaned back in her chair. This isn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Instead, I slid my hand forward, gently covering hers. She flinched at first, then let it rest there, the tension in her body slowly melting away. Her eyes closed for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were softer than I had ever seen. "I've spent so long trying to be strong," she admitted, her voice trembling. "For him, for everyone. Always doing the right thing, even when it left me empty. And now here you are, and it feels like I can finally breathe. But it scares me." I squeezed her hand lightly. "It scares me too. But maybe that's what makes it real." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile but genuine. She looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me, her eyes glistening with something unspoken. Slowly she stood, pulling her hand away only long enough to step closer to my side of the table. For a moment she just stood there, looking down at me, as though weighing every choice, every consequence. Then she leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against mine. The contact was so simple, so tender, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. Her hair brushed against my cheek, her breath warm against my skin. My hands instinctively rose, not to pull her closer, but just to rest lightly at her waist, letting her know she was safe with me. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, not kissing, not rushing, just being. Two people finally letting go of the walls they had built around themselves. When she finally pulled back, her eyes searched mine. "What happens now?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. I thought for a moment, then shook my head gently. "We don't have to know all the answers tonight. All we have to know is that we're not pretending anymore." Her shoulders relaxed at that, and she leaned into me again, this time wrapping her arms around me in a quiet embrace. I held her carefully, my chin resting against her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against my chest. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, soft and steady against the windows. The sound filled the silence between us, a natural rhythm that seemed to echo what we both felt, calm, inevitable, unforced. We sat together on the couch after that, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, my arm around her. There were no grand declarations, no promises too big for the moment. Just the quiet certainty that something had changed. For once, she wasn't pushing me away. For once, I wasn't holding back. And though the future was uncertain, though we both knew the complications that would come, it didn't matter right then. What mattered was the truth we had finally allowed ourselves to acknowledge. That we cared. That we saw each other. That the line she had drawn was no longer a wall, but a doorway. As the rain tapped gently against the glass, she whispered, almost to herself, Maybe it's okay to choose what makes us feel alive." I tightened my arm around her, smiling softly. "Then let's choose it. Even if it's just for tonight." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she closed her eyes, settling against me fully, and I knew her silence was its own kind of agreement. And in that quiet, I realized, sometimes love doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it's found in the stillness, in the choice to stay when walking away would be easier. That night she stayed. And for the first time, either of us pretended it was wrong. 22L